Everyone, it's Tony D with another screenwriting tips video. Today we're talking about the second act. Yes, you've watched Getting Started, you've watched the first act, now we're on to act 2 of your screenplay. So in pragmatic terms, where are we in terms of pages? Well, the first act can be very long. It depends on sort of your genre, but you know, if you're going to spitball it, it's going to be like 30 pages for the first act, 40 pages for your second act, and 30 pages for your third act, roughly speaking. Definitely the second act should encompass the majority of space. It should be the longest of the 3 acts. That's kind of why it's the hardest. There's a few things you need to put in as second act. You need to escalate the action, escalate and heighten whatever it is you're doing. If it's drama, you gotta heighten the drama. If it's comedy, you gotta heighten the comedy. It's also a good place to have a breather in the movie, and I think you kind of know what I mean by that. There's always a scene in movies where the characters maybe take a rest or a break, and maybe you get to know them a little better, where they're in between, you know, 2 points on a map, and they settle down at a campsite for the night, and they got nothing else to do, so they're talking over their situation and maybe getting to know each other a little more. That kind of stuff usually happens in the second act, depending on the kind of movie it is, and depending on how it's paced. If your second act outshines the first act, that's okay. But if your second act is outshining your third act, that's not okay. And if you're thinking about movies and their second act, and chances are, if you remember a movie with an amazing second act, it's probably not a great movie, because that probably means the third act was weak and it didn't end well, which is more important. You really got to get a movie to end well. So you can't outshine your ending. A movie like that, and I have a screenwriter's take on it, is the recent movie Venom. I think, and I explained in my theory in the video, that the studio rewrote the third act because they wanted to get away from the concept of a horror movie superhero and go with something that was a little softer. So they rewrote probably the third act and part of the second act. So if you watch the movie, in my view, the best scene in the movie is the car chase, and then it kind of starts to betray its own foundation. The first act is super strong in Venom. And then the second act is mostly good, except for the very tail end where it's like, wait a minute, they seem to be going in a slightly different direction now. So the fact that the second act, to me, stands out. The car chase is more exciting to watch than the final battle, in my view. The final battle in Venom, to me, was a CGI nightmare. I watched it, but I didn't feel it was real. I didn't feel the stakes. It didn't feel real to me. Whereas with the car chase, I was like, yeah, go Eddie Brock. Another movie that, in my view, has a stronger second act than first or third, and I know I'm going to get some heat from this, but I'm going to say it, Inglorious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino. Now, I'm a huge Tarantino fan, and I don't think Inglorious Bastards is an awful movie, per se, but I have a lot of problems with it. I think the first act, you know, the whole scene with the Nazi and the Jewish people hiding, it's boring. It's a boring scene. The movie picks up when the Inglorious Bastards show up, and they're mostly a second act thing, right? They show up, and finally they start kicking Nazi ass, which is what I expected to see in the movie. Unfortunately, it just ends, and we go back to the girl who now has a boyfriend and runs a cinema, and the Nazis are having a film festival, and I'm just like, what? I didn't want to see this. I wanted to see the Inglorious Bastards kick Nazi butt. Unfortunately, It didn't happen. Now, I blame a lot of that on the marketing of the movie, because the way the movie's marketed, it's all about Brad Pitt and the Inglorious Bastards, and they're going to do all this stuff. And instead, they really only get most of the second act and part of the third act. They feel like, they're splitting the movie with an art house movie, which I kind of understand Tarantino's thinking behind that, because if you had shot that movie in the 70s, that's probably the way they would have shot it. But the reason they would have shot it that way was for pragmatic reasons, because they didn't have the budget, so they had to do all these boring scenes with just the actors in like cafes and stuff, because they didn't have the money to have shoot-em-ups or people's heads exploding or whatever. But Tarantino didn't have that limitation as far as I know, so I was a little perplexed why we didn't see like kick-ass, Quentin Tarantino, Hogan's Heroes with graphic violence, but go figure. So I think in a lot of ways the second act of Inglorious Bastards outshines the first and third acts. So that to me is an unbalanced movie. It's not what you want. It's not like Pulp Fiction, which to me feels like it ends on a real high note, even though the acts are out of order. So second acts have to be good, but they can't be too good. Your best stuff you gotta save for the third act. That shouldn't mean you pull your punches in the second act, because you could always get to the end of your screenplay and say, well, the fight scene I put in the second act really should be at the end of the movie. And at that point, that's when you go back and you edit, and maybe you take those events out and you move them to the third act, and you take whatever you had in the third act and jam them in there and see if you can make that work. Maybe you can't for whatever reason, but it's really hard. You don't want the movie to peak too soon. People got to sit through, another 20, 30 minutes of the movie. If it peaks, they're going to be like, oh, how much longer am I sitting through this? You want the movie to peak at its best possible moment. And you want the payoffs to be good. If you're doing a drama, you want the most dramatic moment at the climax in the third act. You have to put some more dramatic moments in the second act. You just got to make sure they don't outshine the ending. Same thing with action movies, right? So action movies are a little easier because they're pretty straightforward. They're all about the fights. So your best fight scene, obviously, is with the main villain at the end. That's the big fight scene, and that has to be the most awesome one. The scenes leading up to that also need to be cool, but you can't, if you come out with some amazing new move or gadget or whatever, you put it in the second act and it just totally blows away the villain, and in the last act you have to move that gadget or move or whatever, you have to move it into the third act somehow and take, whatever and rewrite it. So third acts or second acts, again, you're looking at about 40 pages. They really should end right around page 70-ish. That's not a hard and fast rule. Again, it depends upon your genre. If you're doing a comedy, comedies tend to be shorter, and action movies, they're going to be shorter. You're talking about closer to 90 than 100 pages. So you're really looking for like 30 in the first act. Comedy requires a lot of setup, and that can be very helpful. The second act's going to be more like 35-ish. And then the third act, let's see, at that point you got 60. Yeah, so the third act's going to be about 25. If you get to the end of your screenplay and you realize, hey, I've only got 85 pages here, where can I put another scene? You got to start looking at the second act. That's where you're going to put, if you have to pad the movie, you got to put it in the second act. You don't want it in the first act, because in the first act, you got to suck people in and get people watching that movie. You also have to think of the producer who's going to read your screenplay. You want them deep in the script before anything slows down. Consequently, you can't put it in the third act. Then you run the risk. The chart of action or whatever you're doing should be like this. That's the first act. Second act goes up. Third act peaks, and then it comes down a little bit. It's like an upside down check. That's what you want. So if you're going to sag a little bit, let it sag in the second act a little bit. That'll be fine. Because most people, you know, if you have to have a scene like that, let me give you an example with one of my favorite movies, Predator 2. The slowest scene in Predator 2 takes place in the second act, and it's a scene where the characters are talking. It's the talking scene. You know, so if you got an action movie or you got a Western, there's always a scene where the characters are around a campfire or they're sitting around, because you also need to give the audience a breather, you know. Sometimes, like, especially in an action movie, you know, you can just keep relentlessly clubbing them over the head with action scene after action scene. You need a scene where the characters are like, oh, let me get a drink of water here and straighten out my clothes and bandage up a little bit before I get into the next fight or whatever. You need that kind of scene. And that's your moment to maybe expand upon the universe a little bit, to expand upon the characters and drop some hints of information that we're going to, you know, that's going to pay off in the third act. And that's the place to have it. You have that scene in the second act. Definitely don't want it in the third act. First act, maybe, if you could get it in there and make it exciting enough for the first act that it feels very organic. Another trick is you just, you know, if it's a comedy, you have a lot of flexibility. And I write a lot of comedy. So with comedy, as long as you're being funny, you're basically safe, right? So you take a movie like Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. There's that great scene where Steve Martin goes to get his rental car and curses out the lady behind the counter, right? So that's a funny scene, but it's kind of like self-contained. They put that scene in the movie. The rumor at the time was they put that scene specifically in the movie to get the R rating. So maybe they went back and reshot a little bit and stuck it in between two scenes. I don't know. Because John Candy, I don't believes in that scene. And I think somebody makes a cameo in that. I want to say Kevin Bacon, but I don't remember who it was. So that's an example of, you know, a way you can sort of wedge some stuff in there. But if it's a comedy, it has to be a comedic scene. If it's a drama, it should be a dramatic scene. Second acts are a place if you do a flashback. You know, flashback could be appropriate there. Flashbacks, you know, maybe you could do one in the first act depending on what the setup is. Second act, it's totally fine. Third act, probably don't want to do a flashback at that point. By the third act, you probably don't want to add new information, really, in terms of like totally new information. If it's a mystery, obviously the third act is going to be these big revelations about, and that's kind of new information, but it's based on information you should have already saw. When I say new information, I mean like, you know, you don't add new characters, new important characters in the third act. I mean, then the audience goes, wait a minute, who the hell is this guy? So, you know, you really want to think about how you can make the third act better in the second act. Anything that can exacerbate the situation when you finally get to the climax is good. So if there's something you could add to raise the stakes. So if, for instance, you find out, you know, not only is the football team, not only do they need to win this game, not only do they need to win it for their friend who was injured, but they also need to win it for a sick kid, let's say. You know, you may find that out in the second act. And that could heighten it even more. And it's just like, holy cow, these guys really got to win this game. So, you know, now they got this sick kid who wants them to win too. You know, that just raises the stakes more and puts more pressure on the characters. And we can hopefully see that in your screenplay. So anything that doesn't drive the movie forward, you probably want to just cut out of the screenplay. But you do need a certain amount of pages. So if you're going to put any scenes that are questionable in that area, if you've got a scene that you're not sure you need, you need it in the second act. Okay, you can't afford a questionable scene in the first or third act. Those two acts are too important. But the second act, the audience can tolerate a little bit of a lag. If you need to explain something, you can use the second act to explain it a little more forcefully or a little more in detail, because it also gives the audience a breather. So if you're doing a comedy and they've been laughing for a solid half hour, yeah, they might need a little break, just sort of, oh my God, this movie's so funny, catch their breath a little bit. Even if they're not totally listening to the scene, which, unfortunately, if you set a bar that high, that could be very possible. I guess what I'm saying is the lesser scenes take place in there. So in the James Bond movies, and I always talk about Bond, what scenes go in the second act? Well, a lot of romantic scenes go in the second act because they're not the focus of the movie. They're just the byproduct of Bond and like icing on the cake for him, right? So the romantic, sexy scenes with the girl, they're almost always in the second act. You're not going to have a sex scene in the third act. There's too much stuff going on. And it's probably a little too early to have it in the first act. He hasn't even gotten to Cairo yet. So the second act, really, it's kind of a dumping ground for scenes in your screenplay. If you don't know where something goes, you probably need to drop it in the second act. Because the first act should be very clear. It's the introduction. It's the problem. It's the character. And they're out on their journey and they're going forward. The third act is your climax, the payoffs, your revelation, and the conclusion. That's all well and good. It's that second act. That's it's a little mind-numbing sometimes, but don't worry about it. Just bang through it. Just get through it. You can always go back and tweak it, and you really can only tweak it after you get done. After you see what the whole movie is, you can step back and go, oh, okay, here's where I started. Here's where I'm ending up. All right, let's examine this middle. And it may just require you shifting a couple of scenes or tweaking them here and there. I was just sending off a story to the Library of Congress, and I remembered a scene where the character does something at the end, and it's kind of a surprise, when you're writing sometimes and you come up with a bit. And I came up a bit with this character, he does something, and then I realized in the middle of the night while I was going to bed, there's no setup for that. So I went back and I dropped it in. I just dropped it in to, it's more in the first act, but, the fact that I mentioned anything at all makes the bit at the end that much stronger. I probably could have done something in the middle too, now that I think about it. If they ever turn it into a TV show, I'm sure they'll probably drop something in where the character does, the first, I don't want to say what the action is because I don't want to talk about the story yet, but there was the first action he sucks at, and then there'd be the second action where he's almost good at it, and then finally at the end where he's really good at it and he does the thing. So you don't necessarily have to have 1, 2, 3. That was just sort of icing on the cake. You kind of think of things later to add into the movie. But, once you get to that third act, once you have a really strong conclusion, and we'll be doing the third act in another video, that's when you go back and you really rewrite and you really fix things. And I think I'm going to have to do a video about the first draft. But that's it for the second act. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful. Please leave a comment. Please donate on Patreon. Go to my websites, the Webcomic Factory and Superfrat. Say something. Say something about a movie if you want me to analyze it. Say something about a particular part of screenwriting you need to know. I'll be happy to make a video for it. Thank you to my first commenter on BitChute who mentioned Shaun of the Dead. Great movie. Love that movie. It's awesome. And that's it. I'll see you next time.